Emeka was running again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dirt road as he raced through the narrow alleyways of their small village, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear his mother's voice echoing in his ears, "Emeka, run faster. You must get there before the market closes." His bare feet kicked up dust, his body drenched in sweat, and his stomach growled loudly. He hadn't eaten since yesterday. Emeka knew if he didn't make it to the market, his family would have to go hungry yet another night. It was a familiar routine, one he swore to himself he'd never repeat when he grew older. The market was already closing when Emeka finally arrived, panting and breathless. Stalls were being packed up, and sellers were counting the day's earnings. He scanned the area, desperate to find anything that hadn't already been bought. His eyes landed on a few scattered yams left in a corner stall. He rushed over, pulling out the small handful of coins his mother had given him. "How much for 2 yams, sir?" Emeka asked, his voice trembling from exhaustion. The seller, a burly man with a thick beard, eyed him lazily. 20 naira each. "You have money, boy." Emeka's heart sank. He didn't have enough. His hands clenched around the coins in his pocket, his mind racing. Maybe he could bargain. Maybe the man would take pity on him. But when he opened his mouth to speak, the seller had already turned his back, uninterested in Emeka's pleas. That night, as Emeka returned home empty-handed, he sat with his mother, father, and little brother in the dimly lit room they called home. His stomach churned with hunger, but what hurt him more was the disappointment in his mother's eyes. He hated seeing her like that, helpless, broken. "I'll never let my family go hungry again," Emeka whispered to himself, his fists clenched tightly. Never. Years passed, and Emeka kept his promise. After leaving his village, he worked day and night, taking odd jobs and saving every naira he could. He learned quickly, seizing every opportunity to earn more. Emeka eventually moved to Aba, where the hustle and bustle of the city fueled his ambition. He was determined to become someone important, someone with riches. The day he struck his first big business deal was the day his life changed forever. Emeka had managed to broker a contract with a foreign company, and within a year, he was making more money than he'd ever dreamed of. His family moved into a beautiful house, far from the crumbling walls of their old village home. There was food on every table, clothes in every wardrobe, and luxury at every turn, but while Emeka basked in his success, his family was starting to feel the strain. Nneka, his wife, had always been a simple woman. She didn't need much to be happy, and the sudden influx of wealth left her feeling overwhelmed. Ifeanyi and Chioma, their children, were equally confused. The constant gifts and feasts felt more like a burden than a blessing. Emeka didn't see it, though. He was too busy ensuring they never experienced hunger or hardship like he had. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Emeka's family began to realize that sometimes, too much of a good thing could be just as harmful as having too little. The table was filled with more food than Nneka had ever seen in her life. Golden fried plantains, steaming pots of jollof rice, tender goat meat, and bowls of fresh fruits were laid out in abundance. The smell was intoxicating, but something was missing. There was no warmth, no laughter, no joy. Nneka stood in the doorway of the dining room, staring at the feast before her. The new house they'd moved into was enormous, with gleaming floors, tall windows, and enough space for everything they could ever want. But it didn't feel like home. It felt cold, like the food on the table, despite its beauty, wasn't meant to be eaten. It was just there. "Where's everyone?" Nneka asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She knew the answer, though. Emeka was working late, as usual. He had become obsessed with making more money, as if there wasn't already enough. Ifeanyi was up in his room, glued to a new tablet Emeka had bought him, lost in some video game. Chioma was likely in the backyard, alone, playing quietly by herself. Nneka's heart ached. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when Emeka promised to give them everything. She had thought everything meant peace, togetherness, and happiness. Instead, it felt like their family was falling apart. The more Emeka gave, the more distant they all became. With a sigh, Nneka sat down at the table. She wasn't hungry, but she knew Emeka expected her to eat. He had been filling their home with more and more food every day, as if it were the only way to show his love. The food was delicious, but it felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on her. She nibbled at a piece of fried yam, pushing the rest of the food around on her plate. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. It was Chioma, her daughter, shuffling into the room, her small feet dragging against the floor. "Mama, I don't want to eat," Chioma said softly, her large brown eyes looking up at Neka. Neka forced a smile. "Why not, my dear? There's so much here. Your papa will be upset if we waste it." Chioma shook her head, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of her dress. "I don't like it when we eat alone. I miss when we used to eat together. Before we moved here." Neka's chest tightened. She knew exactly what Chioma meant. In their old house, before the money, they had always eaten together, huddled around their small, battered table. There wasn't much food back then, but there was warmth. They laughed, told stories, and even sang songs while they ate. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. Now, despite the lavish meals, they barely even spoke. "I miss it too," Neka whispered, pulling Chioma close to her. "I miss it so much." Later that evening, Emeka finally came home. His face was tired, but his eyes were still bright with the excitement of a new deal he had made earlier in the day. He walked into the house, the clink of his leather shoes echoing through the hallway. He headed straight for the dining room, expecting to find his family enjoying the food he had provided. But when he walked in, the sight of half-eaten plates and a quiet room greeted him. His heart sank a little, though he quickly brushed it aside. "Neka," he called out, trying to keep his voice light. "I brought some more food from the city. They have this new restaurant, I think you'll love it." Neka appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. She looked at Emeka, her eyes weary. "Emeka, there's too much. We don't need more food. We hardly even finish what's on the table now." Emeka frowned, confused. "What do you mean? I thought you'd be happy. We never have to worry about being hungry again. We can eat anything we want, whenever we want." "That's the problem," Neka said, her voice trembling slightly. "We have all this food, but we don't have each other anymore. You're always working, Ifeanyi is always in his room, and Chioma. She feels alone. I feel alone." Emeka blinked, stunned. He hadn't realized things were this bad. To him, providing food and gifts had been his way of showing love. He thought that giving his family everything they never had would make them happy. But it hadn't. Instead, it had created a distance he hadn't noticed until now.
"Neka, I don't understand," Emeka began, his voice soft.
"I'm doing all this for us. For you, for the children. I don't want any of us to suffer like I did when I was a boy. I promised myself I'd never let you go hungry." Neka stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "We're not hungry, Emeka. At least, not in the way you think. We need more than food. We need you. The children need you. I need you." For the first time, Emeka felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on keeping his promise to provide that he hadn't noticed how much he was losing along the way.
I don't know what to do," Emeka whispered, his voice barely audible.
He felt lost, as though all the riches in the world couldn't solve this problem. Neka smiled sadly and squeezed his arm. "We'll figure it out together. But first, let's sit down and eat, together." Emeka sat at the head of the table, staring at the untouched food in front of him. For the first time in a long time, the dining room was filled with his entire family. Neka sat to his right, and Ifeanyi and Chioma sat across from each other. But the room still felt heavy, the air thick with silence. Emeka could see it on their faces, something was wrong, and it wasn't just about the food. He glanced over at Ifeanyi, who was absent-mindedly poking at his jollof rice with a fork. Ifeanyi had always been a quiet boy, but ever since they'd moved into this new life of luxury, he had retreated even further into himself. Emeka thought the new tablet, video games, and endless gadgets would bring him joy. But instead, his son seemed more distant than ever. "How was school today, Ifeanyi?" Emeka asked, trying to break the silence. Ifeanyi shrugged without looking up. "It was okay, Papa." Emeka's chest tightened. There had been a time when Ifeanyi would excitedly tell him about everything, his classes, his friends, even the games he played. But now, their conversations were reduced to short, empty exchanges. Emeka didn't know how to reach him anymore. Chioma, on the other hand, had always been full of life. But lately, she seemed quieter too, her once bright and playful spirit dulled by the overwhelming changes in their life. She sat with her small hands folded in her lap, not touching the food in front of her. "Mama," Chioma said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do we have to eat all this food?" Nneka and Emeka exchanged glances. Nneka reached out and placed a hand on her daughter's, her face softening. "No, my dear. You don't have to eat if you don't want to." Emeka felt a pang of discomfort in his chest. He had always believed that having plenty of food was a blessing. Growing up, there had been days when he and his siblings would go to bed with their stomachs empty. He had worked so hard to ensure his children never experienced that kind of hunger. But now, his daughter didn't want to eat. It was as if the abundance he had worked so hard to provide was suffocating them. "Chioma, why don't you want to eat?" Emeka asked gently. She looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "There's just too much, Papa. I miss when it was just the four of us. Together. We used to talk and laugh when we ate. Now, it feels different. I don't like it." Her words hit Emeka harder than he expected. He swallowed the lump forming in his throat, realizing that the very thing he thought would make his family happy was slowly pulling them apart. He had focused so much on providing them with material wealth that he had overlooked the simple things, like sitting down together, sharing stories, and enjoying each other's company. Nneka reached for Emeka's hand under the table, her touch warm and comforting. "We don't need all of this, Emeka," she said softly. "What we need is you. We need to be a family again, not just people living in the same house." Emeka's mind raced. Could it really be that simple? He had worked tirelessly, day and night, to ensure his family never wanted for anything. But now, it seemed like his efforts were misplaced. Could it be that what his family really needed wasn't more food, more money, or more luxury, but more of him? He cleared his throat, his voice steady but uncertain. "I'm sorry," he began. "I thought I was doing the right thing, making sure we never went hungry, that we had everything we needed. But maybe I was wrong." Ifeanyi finally looked up, his eyes meeting his father's. There was a glimmer of hope in his gaze, as if he had been waiting to hear those words for a long time. "It's not about the stuff, Papa," Ifeanyi said quietly. "We just want you here with us." Emeka nodded slowly, the weight of his son's words sinking in. He had been so focused on escaping the poverty of his past that he hadn't realized he was creating a different kind of emptiness in his present. "I'll try to do better," Emeka said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be here more. We'll eat together like we used to. I promise." Nneka squeezed his hand, a small smile forming on her lips. "That's all we've ever wanted, Emeka." For the first time in what felt like forever, the tension in the room began to lift. Emeka felt a sense of relief, though he knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much to fix, so much to rebuild. But for now, it was enough to simply be with his family, to be present in the moment. That night, they sat together at the table, eating slowly and talking quietly. There was still too much food, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were together, sharing a meal, not just filling their stomachs, but reconnecting with each other. The next morning, Emeka woke up early, determined to make good on his promise. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, he sat up in bed, his mind buzzing with thoughts. He had been working so hard for so long that he wasn't sure how to just be present. But he would learn. He had to. Nneka stirred beside him, slowly waking. She glanced over at Emeka, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "You're up early," she murmured. "I want to be here with you. I want to make breakfast for the family today," Emeka replied, smiling at her. It was a small gesture, but one he hoped would show his family that he was serious about being more involved. Nneka smiled back, her face soft and full of understanding. "That sounds nice, Emeka." Emeka rose from bed, feeling a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. He hadn't cooked in years, not since they moved to their new house and could afford to hire help. But today, he wanted to do it himself. In the kitchen, he fumbled with the ingredients, struggling to remember how Neka used to make the dishes they all loved. He cracked eggs into a bowl, chopped onions, and prepared the frying pan. The smell of sizzling food soon filled the house, drawing the attention of Ifeanyi and Chioma. They appeared in the kitchen doorway, their eyes wide with surprise. "Papa?" Ifeanyi asked, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "You're cooking?" Emeka laughed, wiping his hands on a towel. "Yes, I am. Today, we're going to eat together, just like we used to." Chioma's face lit up with a smile. "I can help," she said eagerly, rushing over to the counter to stand by her father's side. Ifeanyi hesitated for a moment, then slowly joined them, curiosity getting the better of him. Together, they worked on preparing breakfast, and for the first time in a long while, the kitchen was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation. As they sat down to eat, the mood around the table was lighter than it had been in months. The food wasn't perfect, Emeka had burned the eggs, and the plantains were a little too crispy, but no one seemed to care. It wasn't about the food. It was about being together again. Neka glanced around the table, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. This was the family she had missed, the simple moments she had longed for. But even as she smiled, there was a nagging feeling at the back of her mind, a worry that this change wouldn't last. She knew how deeply rooted Emeka's fear of poverty was, how hard he had worked to escape it. Could he really let go of that fear, or was this just a temporary break in the storm? She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the warmth of the moment. They were happy now, and that was what mattered. Over the next few days, Emeka made a conscious effort to spend more time with his family. He cut back on work, turned off his phone during meals, and sat with Ifeanyi and Chioma after school, listening to their stories and playing games with them. For the first time in years, he felt connected to his children. He was no longer just a provider, he was a father again. But as the days turned into weeks, the cracks beneath the surface began to show. It started with the bills. Emeka had cut back on work, but the lifestyle they were living hadn't changed. The house was large and expensive to maintain. There were still new clothes, toys, and gadgets arriving at their doorstep, remnants of the habits Emeka had developed when he was obsessed with giving his family everything they could ever want. One evening, as Emeka was going through the mail, he froze when he opened the latest bill from the electricity company. It was higher than usual, much higher. His heart began to race as he flipped through the rest of the bills, each one worse than the last. Mortgage payments, utility bills, credit card balances. The numbers blurred together, overwhelming him. He had promised his family he would be there more, but at what cost? If he didn't get back to work, they would lose everything. The house, the car, the comfort they had grown used to, it could all disappear in an instant. Neka noticed the change in Emeka's demeanor that night. He was quiet, his face tense as he stared at the bills in his hand. "Emeka, what's wrong?" she asked gently. He shook his head, trying to force a smile. "Nothing, Neka. Everything's fine." But she could see through him. "Emeka, please. Talk to me." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's the bills, Neka. They're piling up. I've cut back on work, but I don't know how we're going to keep up if I don't start making more money again." Neka's heart sank. She had hoped that this new chapter of their lives would bring them closer together, but now she realized that the shadow of Emeka's fear was still hanging over them. The money, the wealth, it was still a part of him, deeply rooted in his need to protect his family from the poverty he had once known. "We don't need all of this, Emeka," Neka said softly. "The house, the gadgets, the constant new things. They don't matter. What matters is us, being together. We can downsize. We can live more simply." Emeka looked at her, torn between his desire to provide and the growing realization that his family needed something different from him. He had spent so long believing that money was the answer to everything, that he didn't know how to let go of that idea. "I don't want us to struggle, Neka," he said quietly. "I don't want the children to ever feel the way I felt growing up." Neka took his hand in hers, her voice gentle but firm. "We won't struggle, Emeka. We'll have each other, and that's enough. You've already given us so much. Now, let's focus on what truly matters. Emeka stared at the bills in front of him, his mind swirling with doubts and fears. He wanted to believe her, to trust that they could be happy without the constant pursuit of wealth. But deep down, a part of him still feared the hunger that had haunted his childhood. Would he be able to let go of that fear? Could he truly put his family first, even if it meant living with less? Thank you for watching our video. Tell us where you are watching from in the comments section. Please do not forget to subscribe and like our video. See you in our next video. Bye.